Hey everyone, I'm Aaronica, and today I'm super excited to share some essential sewing tips for beginners. Sewing has obviously been a huge part of my life. In fact, I never thought that this is what would blow up the way that it blew up. And through my journey, I have, of course, learned that anyone can sew. It's really just a matter about taking those first few steps as well as embracing the process. So, whether you're looking to create some custom pieces, dive into a new hobby, or even make sewing part of your sustainable lifestyle, you're in the right place. Okay, but so why sewing, right? It's not because it's cheaper to make your own clothes. That is not what it's about. Trust me, and my bank account, that is not it at all, okay? But sewing does open up a world of creativity as well as personal expression. It's not just about making clothes, it's about crafting a piece of your entire identity. Plus, it's a really great way to promote sustainability by creating and repairing your very own garments. And of course, let's not forget about the therapeutic benefits. It's my go to stress buster. Have a long day? Touch some fabric. The kids annoying me? Make something new. In fact, that's actually how I got through my very first quilt top. I was so upset with my kids that I was like, I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to sew all of these straight lines until I feel better. And wouldn't you know, by the time that I finished that quilt top, your girl was no longer upset. Stress buster, baby. Let's talk about some basic sewing supplies because that's what you need to get started. One of the most popular questions that I get asked is, what kind of sewing machine do I need? Or what's the best sewing machine out there? Here's the thing, you don't have to have any kind of fancy sewing machine in order to get started. And yes, I see the irony as I sit in front of two Berninas. Here's the thing though, you don't need to start sewing on a Bernina. Do you know how long I was sewing before I actually got a Bernina? A very long time. A very, very long time. So you don't really need a whole lot of fancy equipment. You just need a reliable sewing machine, some fabric scissors, like literally only fabric, okay? Don't use these for paper, plastic, or anything else. Protect these with your life, okay? Some thread, obviously. A seam ripper, it's gonna be your best friend, even though it makes you feel like you're a failure when you have to take it out. You are not. And of course, a measuring tape. Those are some of your go to tools, the things that you really need to get started. If you're picking out a sewing machine, do not stress over having all the advanced features. Focus on finding something that is user friendly, fits all of your needs, and is within your budget. Here's a thing that I want to briefly talk about when it comes to sewing machines. You do not need to get a sewing machine that has a million and one stitches. I remember when I was purchasing one of my most recent sewing machines that I had purchased before I went to my Bernina. And I remember being specific and looking for the machine that had the most amount of stitches. For what? For what? Let me tell you this. When you are sewing, you are normally using a straight stitch, especially if you're sewing woven garments or you're making bags or you're doing quilting. You do need to use a little zigzag situation, right? And that's only really if you're finishing edges or you're sewing something that is a stretch garment, right? Everything else is like really optional, to be completely honest, right? That's why we see that those industrial machines, they typically only sew straight stitches and that's it. Like you can move your needle over a couple of spaces and that's it because they're like, what else do you need to do besides sew these here straight lines? Straight stitching, that's going to be your jam, okay? So the best places to go ahead and find a sewing machine that's not going to break your budget, hit up Facebook Marketplace. There are so many people getting rid of their machines. Some of them have either grown out of them. Some of them bought them during the pandemic and was like, I'm going to learn to sew. And then they were like, actually, sewing is not for me. Some of them are getting rid of things from just like things, hobbies that they no longer take advantage of. All of that, right? Buy used. It does not have to be brand new in order to be good enough to use. If I told you how many times I tried to make leggings before I made them successfully, you would probably be like, but girl, do you even sew? Listen, understanding fabric and patterns is a top tier technique. Why do I say that? Because this is going to be what sets you aside from someone who makes all the mistakes in the world and wastes lots of fabric to someone who is just like, oh, I actually know that this fabric is not going to work for this project. Okay. Now, if you ever sew live with me, then you already know that I feel like Patterns and tutorials, those things are just merely suggestions. But fabric suggestions, those are not just suggestions, right? I got to be honest, it's normally best to go with whatever the fabric, whatever the designer has actually suggested. And one of the things that I have learned through pattern design, whether it is for the big five or for indie, is that the designer typically designs with with a type of fabric in mind. So that is something to be mindful of. Now, if you have mastered some of these beginner techniques and you're ready to take on, mixing and matching different types of fabrics with patterns and like saying, I don't even care what you have to suggest to me, designer, cool. I love that for you. Until we get there, let's go over understanding fabrics and patterns, right? It's going to be a game changer. Fabrics, of course, come in all textures and weights and drapes and all of that beautifulness. And selecting the right one can really truly make or break your project. And when it comes to patterns, using a projector, which of course y'all already know I love, can simplify the process. Now, as a beginner, I don't suggest using a projector to start off. Why? Because I feel like one of the reasons why projector sewing became so easy for me is because I spent so many years seeing what pattern pieces looked like and how they were going to fit and what adjustments I needed to make. And I was able to physically manipulate those things with the paper. So just my 2 cents there. Okay. Um, but really, it's all about making sewing accessible as well as enjoyable. Now, when it comes to your fabric, of course, in your patterns, when you are using a pattern that is designed for a woven fabric. Now, if you're like, Aaronica, what's a woven fabric? I'm like looking around. I'm like, what do I have in front of me? So this is a woven fabric. This is like a silk woven fabric. They don't have stretch. And if they do have stretch, it's just going to be a simple mechanical stretch. Knit fabrics also come in a plethora of styles. And we know that with knit fabrics, like this here rib knit, you have stretch, right? Whether it's two-way or four-way, whether you consider it to be two-way or four-way, because my understanding is that some people consider four-way, two-way stretch because it only stretches in two ways, or vertical and horizontal, which is, I guess, technically two. But you understand what I'm saying here. When a pattern is designed for something that is a knit garment, a lot of times they do not have a lot of ease. And if you're like, Aaronica, what is ease? I talk a lot about ease because ease for me has been a game changer in learning about sewing. Ease means how it's going to fit on your body, right? It takes into account your current measurements and how that fabric is going to fit on there. Now, when you are sewing with like knit fabric, you can typically get away with negative ease, meaning that the finished garment is going to be your body measurements minus, which is why it's negative ease, however much negative ease that designer has put in. Why can you get away with that? Because it's designed for stretch fabric. So it can stretch, it stretches to fit your body, right? But if you're sewing with a woven pattern, there is always going to be positive ease put in. Why? Because this isn't stretching, this ain't going anyplace, right? So that means that if your body is stretching, so like when you sit down and if you have a tummy or if you've got like a thicker waist and these things begin to expand, that's not gonna work with that woven fabric because your body is gonna be expanding and that fabric's gonna be like, I'm not going anyplace. Like we in here, we're good. So that is something to consider. Now, can you mix and match patterns with fabrics? In a way, you can, but honestly, that's a more advanced technique. Now, it's kind of easy to take a knit fabric and use for a woven pattern. Why? Because you don't have to worry about whether or not it's going to fit if your body expands. It's fine, right? You might want to size down. It'll work though. But can you take a pattern that is designed for knits and put it in with woven fabric? The answer to that is also yes, but again, very advanced technique. Don't recommend for beginners because you're going to end up frustrated. Or try it. I love that for you. Take chances. I'm here for it. So let's talk very briefly about some basic sewing techniques. Now, I do want to just preface this by saying that hand sewing is just not my favorite, even though that's how I started off. Why is it not my favorite? Because your girl is Speedy Sogales, and I like to be able to finish my projects within a certain amount of time. I know that for some people, sewing is not necessarily about the speed or about the time, but I became more active sewing when I was homeschooling my kids, which meant that I typically had maybe about an hour of dedicated sewing time before it was time for me to teach a lesson or before it was time for me to wrangle a child, right? So for me, it was always really important for me to be able to get close to finishing a project within that hour of time frame. So that was something that kind of helped me to sew faster and get a better handle of things because I just simply did not have the time and I didn't have the luxury of having that time. So I want to say that, preface this section by saying that. Now, mastering some of the basic techniques can really set a good and solid foundation for all of your sewing projects. Um, so that means like learning how to thread your machine, and every machine has a little different, right? So for my Bernina B590, it's threaded completely different than my L890. But also because of where my bobbin is, I don't have a drop-in bobbin. Um it it's a little bit different. But ultimately, there's a couple of key things even when working with your machine that you need to know. Like, so if you're changing your threads out, definitely snip from above and pull it through. Why? Because if you pull it up, you can run the risk of messing up your tension, right? So there are a couple of those things that I will be going over in a later video when we talk about how to thread your machine, okay? Um Understanding the stitches that you'll use most often, right? So I said that the two stitches that you really use are straight stitch as well as your zigzag stitch. Why? Because straight stitch, you can even get away with using a straight stitch on stretch garments. I personally don't love to do that because your girl's over here popping stitches left and right, and I just do not like that sound. Um, but there are decorative stitches which are fun, but you don't need those for construction. Those are merely just like a razzle dazzle, a little bit of cherry on top of the icing, right? You don't need that in order to complete a garment. They're fun, yes. Necessary? No. Okay. Um, the best way to finish your seams, understanding that is definitely something that is going to be a game changer. So, how do you finish your seams? Now, when you're working with something that is a woven, and if you join me for my sew along where I actually use this fabric, I talked a lot about how the fraying was fraying, right? It was like fraying hard. So, what I mean by fraying, if you look here, that is the fraying action. So when you're sewing with woven garments, the edges are going to fray simply because of how it is that they were constructed and woven together, as well as the fabric content. In order to finish these, you will either need to use that zigzag stitch, an overlock stitch, or just use a serger. Now, if you're like, hey girl, I said I was a beginner. What is a serger? Babe, we'll talk about it another time. I got you. But you can finish those seams with your sewing machine as well. Another tool to have on hand, of course, is just a little bit of um, fray stuff, right? It's an anti-fray, and this is what that frame looks like, y'all. Whew, the frame will get you, right? And sealing those seams is something that's important. Now, when you're working with knit fabric, it does not fray. It just simply does not fray. Now, some knits will curl. If you have a cotton base, it will simply curl when you go ahead and pull it. I was trying to see if I had a cotton base down here, but I don't think I do. Um, yeah, I don't think I have a cotton base. But like, this is a Peach Performance. So this is an athletic knit. And as you can see here, like I've cut both of these sides. There's really nothing to finish if I'm being completely honest. Like it's fine for this to say exactly how it is. Yes, you can do a little fold over and hem if you would like to, but also if you don't want to, you don't necessarily need to. When you pull it, as you can see, it's not fraying, it's not going anyplace. None of these the woven stitches are coming undone. So when it comes time to actually finish your seams, you don't really need to do very much with those knits, but those wovens, you do. Absolutely. Okay. When it comes to cutting, this can be something that is a very personal thing. And I say that very seriously, but also not so seriously, right? So now I said that you should get a good pair of fabric shears. I don't cut with fabric shears anymore though. When I first started sewing, fabric shears were my fave. It's like, to me, it was like the only way to go, right? But because I use a projector, and I actually started doing this before I started using my projector, I began to use a rotary cutter. Now a rotary cutter is absolutely my favorite cutting tool. Why? Because it just makes it so much easier to just go through with one hand stroke. Um, it just makes it easier for me. But if you're like, well, where do I cut? Make sure that you have a self-healing mat to cut upon, especially if you're going to be using a rotary cutter, or to pin through. Now, I also started out using that like big fold out cardboard mat. Those are fantastic, especially if you don't necessarily have a dedicated cutting space. Putting that on the floor so that you can pin your patterns to your fabric is a fantastic thing. Why? Because it prevents you from actually pinning that carpet. It's happened to me. If you're like, hey girl, I have wooden floors or I don't have carpeting. Well, one, how does it feel to be God's favored? But also, you want to protect your floor anyway. Okay, so making sure that you have those proper things down there, definitely the way to go. So, one of the other things that I think is important to discuss is, of course, how you maintain a seam allowance. Now, if you're like, hey girl, what is a seam allowance? What does that even mean? Your seam allowance is literally the distance from where your stitch is to where the end of your fabric is, right? Now, when you're cutting your fabric out, there's going to be a line that you need to make sure that you cut on. That includes a seam allowance. Now, the designer will specify what the seam allowance is. Typically for the big five, it's going to be 5/8 seam allowance. That is aggressive. For my patterns that I design, it's typically about a 3/8 seam allowance, 3/8 to a 1/4 inch, right? So how do you maintain that? Like how do you know when these things are there? Let's actually first take a look at this here. This is my favorite little tool. This is actually a magnetic seam allowance gauge where you can just plop this onto your machine wherever it needs to stay. But I want to take you to my machine and show you the grooves that are on there, because I also think that that's really helpful because pretty much all of the machines have it. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so clearly I was working on some buttons last time I was at my machine, but right here, each of these each of these little markings on here actually differentiates or highlights what where it is, right? So this is 5/8 seam allowance right here. Assuming that your needle is in the middle, then and you line your fabric up here, that's going to give you the 5/8 seam allowance. So if I have a 5/8 seam allowance, then I'm going to line my seam gauge up here. Actually, let me take my foot off here. And so when we talk about needle position, my needle position right here is at center point. The way that I know that, let me put on my other foot. Okay, so this right here is the center of the foot. And because my needle is lined up with that center of the foot, I can tell that this right here is going to be my 5/8 seam allowance. Then because each of these smaller lines are broken up essentially into quarters, or I'm sorry, into eighths, right? So this becomes 4/8 or 1/2 of an inch. This is 3/8, which is what my normal seam allowance is. And then there is a very tiny marking right here, and that is going to be that 1/4 seam allowance. So now assuming that that's what I need to line it up with, then I just go ahead and I move it on over here, or I move it over to wherever I need it to. Okay. So I feel like that is super important. If you're like, hey girl, I don't feel like, or my machine doesn't hold on to this very well, utilizing washi tape is a really great option for you to do as well. Washi tape is fantastic when it comes to marking your seam allowances or utilizing it on your machine because it doesn't leave a residue. Now, if you move your needle over, I'm going to go ahead and just move mine over, and you can see how it moves over 1 point. Typically, the amount that it moves over is going to be about like 1 millimeter. So that's something that's important to note as well. So now let's talk about some common sewing mistakes and how you can avoid them or just simply fix them. Not maintaining your seam allowance is a huge sewing mistake, right? Excuse me, which is the reason why I wanted to take the time to kind of go over what that seam allowance looks like and what techniques that you can personally use in order to learn how to maintain it. Because it can be hard, especially when no one actually teaches how to maintain a seam allowance. Like, I never learned it. In fact, I didn't realize that I didn't learn it until I went to teach my daughter how to maintain a seam allowance because she wanted to make a skirt. And I was like, okay, you've got to maintain like I think it was a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And she was like, what is that? And how do I know how to do that? If something is not fitting the right way, chances are you didn't maintain that seam allowance, okay? But here's the thing. We all learn from mistakes. Mistakes are common. Even I make mistakes, and you see that, especially if you have sewn with me, because I showcase them, especially if I'm live. Mistakes are nothing to be embarrassed about, nothing to be scared of. Typically, most mistakes that you make while sewing can easily be fixed with your handy dandy seam ripper. That's why I said keep it around, right? A seam ripper is not proof that you failed. A seam ripper is proof that you tried something and it didn't work out the way that you thought it was. So now you're going to just simply undo it. One of the other most common issues is not paying attention to your thread tension. I know it's like, Aaronica, thread tension, what is that? Typically, so on my machine, things look a little bit different, which is why I'm not going to take you over there and show you that. But your thread tension is typically coming from your bobbin, right? So your bobbin, you can either make it tighter, looser, etc. Now, if you see some like puckering, that means that your thread tension is off. So the most common tension to have your thread on is about 4 to 5, just for your basic average fabric. And you're going to need to change your thread tensions depending upon the thickness, the weight of your fabric. So like if I'm going for a silk, my tension might be lighter. Whereas if I'm going for something that is like thicker, like a Sherpa, then my tension is going to be a little bit thicker, right? So those are things to keep in mind. And you can see that based upon how your stitch looks. If it looks like it's puckering or if it looks like it's too loosey-goosey, right? Then it will tell you that your thread tension is off, right? Another is skipping pre-washing your fabrics. Now, I did a whole video that did not get enough traction, in my opinion, about pre-washing your fabrics. You should pre-wash your fabrics how you plan to wash them after that garment is made. Okay, let me say that one more time. Pre-wash your fabrics in the same way that you plan on washing the garment that you make from it. Why? The first reason is because of all of the dirt, grime, and excess inks that are left on there, right? Are you going to be wearing that? Ew. But definitely check out the entire video for the things that come off. The second reason is that if you plan on using a fabric that is like a cotton base and it is woven, baby, you need to pre-shrink it because you might have bought 2 yards, you pre-shrink it, now you got 1.5 yards, right? Now you may or may not be able to finish your project, but also if you had not pre-washed, you make your project, now it's not going to fit. It's going to look like you're wearing like your little sister's pants or your little brother's jacket. That's not what you want. That's not what we want for this life. Okay. So that's the other reason why you want to pre-wash your fabrics in the same way that you plan on washing the garment. So for example, I'm going to just turn this camera slightly. So for this jacket right here, this blazer, this fabric was already pre-washed, right? Now, this Ankara typically doesn't really shrink very much, but here's the thing. If it did, and this oversized blazer, which once fit oversized, would no longer be fitting oversized, and we would be over here like big girl and little jacket. And that's not what we want. That's not even the energy that we're trying to keep at all. Okay, friends? That's not what you want for your life, okay? Um, Another really big common sewing mistake. Whew, hard for me to talk about it because girl failed so much with this one. Listen, if you are making something like leggings or something that calls for a stretch in both directions, either like, so we're going vertical and horizontal, make sure you check your stretch content, okay? Because otherwise you won't be pulling them leggings up over any lovely lady lumps, no boy humps, none of it, okay? Nothing is going anywhere. And you're going to be sitting there like, why doesn't this fit? Okay. Make sure that you're always checking your stretch content for the garments that you're making, especially if it's something that is requiring that it has vertical stretch. Oftentimes that will get us caught up. Okay. And that's something to factor in when you're doing neck bands as well as wristbands. Why? Because when you have a fabric that can only stretch 2 ways, let's see. So for example, this here athletic knit, this has fantastic stretch this way, fantastic stretch that way, great for leggings, wonderful, right? We stretching all over the place. But if I'm going to choose another fabric, let's see what we have in my fabric. No, that one stretches really well too. Let's see. So for example, for this fabric, we don't have as much vertical stretch here. This would be a very big fail when it came time to like making something that I needed four-way stretch for. But horizontal stretch is there. Here's the other thing. This is going to not make the same garment that, or it's not going to behave the way that you want it to. So something to be very mindful of. Okay. So, very, very important. I can't tell you how much fabric that I've wasted. Another thing that I have seen is people not marking their notches. It's me. I'm people. Yeah, I have gone very, very often without marking my notches. And then when it's time to line some things up, I have been like, well, why isn't it lining up? So let's talk about those notches for a second, because there's a couple of different things that I want to share with you that will help you in making those notches a little bit easier, because notches matter. So let's get into how to mark some notches, because this was something that, again, no one specifically taught me, but your girl is here for you now, okay? So everyone talks about tailor's chalk. So this is what tailor's chalk looks like. This is really cool. I love it. I don't have a tailor's chalk sharpener, and I feel like I should have one, right? Because I want my stuff to stay sharp if I'm using it. Another really great option is having erasable pens. These are heat erasable or heat soluble pens. Fantastic. I love this for us. This also goes away with heat as well. Okay. So important to note. One of the other tools that I really like, or rather I was just sent, and I think is super cool, is this magic chalk liner. So this one is a refillable cartridge. I love this. Shout out to Taylor Seville, who sent this to me. Because you can refill it very easily. So like if you want it to be in a different color, you can refill it in a different color, because they come in like white, pink, blue, yellow. But then this also has a brush, because nobody wants to be walking around looking chalky and dusty, okay? Let's be real here. But make sure that you're marking those notches, okay, friends? Mark the notches, not line things up the right way. That is a big, big, big thing. Also, make sure that you're using the right thread for the project. We had to let it marinate. We had to let it sit for a second. The right thread and the right needle for the project, right? So I've been working with a bunch of different fabrics, and I was getting ready to sew this silk that I had shown you, and I had a denim needle in my machine. I was like, oh, no, 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 no. Had to take that out and put the proper needle in. Universal needles are a thing. I love them. I use them regularly. I also keep on hand, of course, a good ballpoint needle for my jersey knits, or so just for my knit fabrics. I barely use my sewing machine for my knits, but that's something else, right? Because I've got a serger for that. Make sure that you've got a denim knit if you plan on, a denim needle if you plan on sewing denim. Make sure that you do have like needles for the finer fabrics in life, okay? Those are some of the more common needles that you can have if you plan on getting into bag making. Make sure that you do actually have like a leather or a vinyl needle, because these things will make a difference in your project. The last mistake that I'm going to highlight is not pressing. I know. Like, I have such a love-hate relationship with my irons. I have the best Oliso irons in the world. Shout out to Oliso. But I still don't love ironing or pressing, even though I see a huge difference in my projects. Simple as that. Like, press, iron. Not only does it make your project look really good, but when you're sewing with woven fabrics, it makes completing your project so much easier. And it gives a really important finish, sealing those stitches in and looking really, really good. So let's talk about some simple project ideas for beginners. Now, some people say things like pillowcases or tote bags. Why? Because, they teach you straight lines. They teach you how to do these certain things. The one and only sewing class that I ever took, we had to make a drawstring backpack. I hated it. It made me not love sewing. So that's not what I'm going to say. What I'm going to say is, if you want to sew bags, absolutely start out with like a pillowcase or a tote bag or something like that. And especially if you're a conservative learner, great projects to start out with. I love that for us, right? Because who doesn't need a pillowcase and who doesn't need yet another tote bag, okay? But if you're like, no, girl, I'm ready to get into garment making, get a dolman style t-shirt. If you're like, well, where do I get that from? I don't really want to spend a lot of money. Made for Mermaids has the Page Pico, which is free. It comes in both youth as well as adult sizing. If you are a man and you're like, hey, or if you're like, I really want more boxy cut, here's the thing about the dolman style. It is already kind of boxy. So it can be used, it's named for, I actually feel like Paige can be a boy's name too, but I digress. But it's a pattern that is versatile enough for all body types in all kind of shapes. You can make it boxier if you want to, or you can make it curvier, right? It's a fantastic pattern to start out with because you don't have to worry about putting sleeves in. It'll help you to get to know your garments working with different knit fabrics. If you're like, what about wovens? Do you have a woven pattern recommendation for me? And I do. For my babes who want to start out with a woven like top pattern, I highly suggest the Cielo top from Closet Core Patterns. It's fantastic. It's kind of like a boxy woven top. I love it. We might even be making it this week. Who knows? But it is super easy. And it will help you to learn how to just sew in a straight line. I will say that people are scared to sew with knits. I don't understand why, because knits are bae. But if you're like, your girl has some quilting cotton on hand or whatever, go ahead and just jump into that Cielo pattern, okay? So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this video, okay? So I know that starting something new can be really daunting, but remember, every expert, and I say expert loosely, right? Because there's always space to learn. Sewist was once a beginner, okay? Take it one stitch at a time and don't be afraid to make mistakes. They're just learning or design opportunities. And if you're looking for more guidance, check out any of my other videos. If you're like, hey girl, I would really love to learn with you 101, I actually start teaching at Top Stitch ATL if you're local to Atlanta. And I don't know, I might actually start to launch a digital program as well. But thank you so much for watching. If you found these tips really helpful, definitely give this video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, subscribe for more sewing content. If you're like, hey, I really loved and found this video helpful, go ahead and buy me a super. I've never encouraged anyone to do this before, but I'm going to do it today because I have also said that I have been working really hard to monetize this channel, and I have. Now I'm able to run ads, but also you guys can buy me supers if you're like, treat yourself to some new coffee because you know I love coffee. But by all means, get in there, right? I do think that I will be launching a subscription very soon, and might be like some beginner sewing tips and techniques where we go over things in more detail. Who knows? But definitely make sure that you're subscribed to stay up to date on what's going on with that. I would absolutely love to see anything that you create, so don't hesitate to share your projects with me. You can definitely be sure to tag me at Needle and the Bell on Instagram so I can see what you have going on, or if you have questions, make sure that you drop them below. Happy sewing, and remember, creativity is the thread that binds us all together. So I'll see you in the next video. Take care.